Hello and welcome. Thank you for watching our presentation today. The law offices of McLaughlin and Associates and McLaughlin Mediation and Consulting focus on helping small to mid-sized businesses grow and thrive. You started your business because of your passion. Let us help you with that vision. We offer a variety of legal and human resources services. Check out our website for more details at www.ma-lawpc.com. And now, on to our presentation.
So the first thing we're going to start with is we're going to talk about kind of what are the reasons why people split up their businesses. Then we're going to launch into a section where we're going to talk about what you should be doing on the front end, the proactive side. And then we're going to flip it. What happens if you don't agree? How does that all play out? And what are the options that you have on that? And then at the end, we're going to talk about a little bit about kind of mediation, some of the alternative dispute resolution options that are available. We talk about it in particular because I'm a mediator, and so that's one service that we also provide in addition to just hiring us to be a lawyer to go and fight. We can be the neutral who can resolve that sometimes, so that's a good thing to think about. So I broke this down in the good and the bad reasons. I have quote unquote, right? So they're not always good reasons, but they're reasons why people do split their partnerships. So economic sustainability, a lot of times it comes down to economics. It doesn't make any sense to keep a business going, or one person, kind of wants to deal with it, the other one doesn't. So those are valid reasons why you do it. Mergers with a larger company, so you have a specialized product or service. If a larger company is going to buy you, sometimes that makes a lot of sense. We saw that obviously in the last couple of years, kind of on post-COVID, people would merge and they would move on. Technological changes. So if you think about the horse and buggy, you remember how those technological changes occurred. Same thing we have now. We have the idea of like the gig economy, as we have the kind of the remote, how the technology comes into play. So a lot of the ways that people ran their businesses have changed, and so as they downsize, sometimes they can sell off parts of their business and they can still make more money. So that's a thing. Industry changes, same type of situation where something that was good 5 or 10 years ago now is no longer, but again, you can pivot. Maybe one person wants to go in that direction, the other person wants to go into a different industry. And then finally, death and disability, which is not a good thing, but with planning, it can be taken into account. So when you have the death of an owner, especially somebody who's primarily in there, that's devastating. That's one of my bad reasons. But if you plan it properly, if you have life insurance, or if you have succession planning and that, then at least you can deal with that situation. So on the flip side, we talk about those bad reasons. The number one issue we see is control, always control. It's either older generation control, but sometimes it's even younger. So whoever's got money, whoever's the one who thinks they're the most important, and it's worse in a family situation because as you know people, you hit it. In fact, on a daily basis, I get those calls. And I sort of have to play two roles. So on the one side, I play lawyer, but I sort of have to play counselor because it's not my job to split up families. It's my job to help people understand that you're trying to resolve something with your family and trying to maintain those issues. A lot of times attorneys, I shouldn't say a lot of times, but there are kind of a brand of attorneys who will just fight, and they don't think about that human side of it, and I don't think that that's a good thing. Divorce is another one, obviously, so I saw that a lot of that happen actually in 2007, if you remember when we had kind of that first decline. There were a lot of family-owned businesses and just the stress that comes with that. I haven't actually seen it so much, surprisingly, in a post-COVID environment. Maybe we'll see that in the next couple of years as kind of if the economy kind of stays where it is. But that's a big deal because what happens is that the breadwinner, when everything's going well in a family, then you're the greatest thing. And then when it goes south, then of course all the blame game happens. And so all the reasons that come with divorce, it just becomes even worse. And then you have the issues about valuation. So the person who's been used to living kind of the nice life, suddenly the business is tanked, but they still expect a lot. And so that causes a lot of issues, and that's why that planning matters. Licensing and credentialing. So things like doctors, and you could have someone who's an accountant, it could be an attorney, somebody who suddenly they get censured or they lose their license or there's an issue with that. Overnight, that could stop it. The ability to transition those businesses is a problem. So, for example, I'm an attorney, I'm licensed. I can't leave that to a child who can't practice law. So that's not a succession plan for me to say, well, if I die, we'll just leave it up to chance. So if I don't have a partner to take that on, then I have to have some kind of a plan. And so sometimes you'll have in a business situation, you have the person who's actually the licensed person. Same thing with trades. And anything where you have somebody who has to have a license, and then there's someone else who doesn't, and they don't want to go through the education and training to do it, or they don't have the expertise. Litigation, obviously that's a bad thing. That happens a lot. And criminal activity and fraud. So criminal activity would be, it could be things like embezzlement, but what I've run into issues where, so the whistleblowing type of thing, or you have, there's something called QUITAM, Q-U-I-T-A-M litigation. And what it is somebody who's disgruntled on the inside will say that there's been a licensing or some type of a fraud issue, and they get investigated. And even if you, in good conscience, were doing the right thing, you're still stuck with it. And so the government can come in there and shut you down, or sometimes in order to reach resolutions, you do that. You also think about situations with, they say, tax, where someone did so-called tax evasion. They didn't intend to, but they got messed up, and suddenly that business is gone. And then I told you about death and disability. The kind of the bad side would be you're not planning, and then overnight something catastrophic happens. And I'm involved, in a couple cases like that where that's exactly what happens. Everything's fine, and then it's not. So the next thing we're talking about is who influences those decisions to end a partnership. Now, many times people think it's just them. Well, I want out, and therefore that's all I need to worry about. But all of these different people who aren't partners in the business make that decision. The number one would be financial. So bankers, there are people who say, well, why don't I just exit out of the business? And it happens all the time. Someone literally just shuts down and they don't do anything further in the business. If you ever look at a loan that you get, there's a clause guaranteed that says if the ownership changes by more than a certain percentage, it's either 25% or 50%, you're in default. And they'll come in and they have usually a security interest against your assets, and they'll come and seize everything, or they can shut down the business. And so I think a lot of people don't think about that. So most family-owned businesses would be 50-50, whether it be a husband and wife, whether it be two brothers, two sisters, brother and sister, mom, dad, doesn't really matter. If one of them comes out, that's going to be a problem. And so that's a big deal. SBA kind of is the same way. SBA has certain requirements. And I think, I'd be curious to see if there's some changes that happen even with SBA lending. There's a lot of fraud that's going on with the PPP loan issues, and I think you're going to see a lot of issues with the government loans changing because there were guarantees that people are taking advantage of that, they stress the government. Your vendors are going to have an effect on that, because the relationships are creditworthiness, A, and B, what can you actually do? So we know in anything there's personality conflicts. There's the ones that vendors like to work with and the ones they don't. So when the one that they don't like to comes out, suddenly you start having, we're not going to extend the credit to the way that we used to. And what used to be kind of smooth sailing now is no longer smooth sailing. Your customers the same way, the relationships that are there, especially if you have somebody who's operations, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, and then a person who's sales, okay? So when the operations person wants to leave, you're like, well, hey, it's great, but the salesperson probably isn't running the company, and suddenly there's like a tail off in the quality that's happening. Split side, you have somebody who's in the operations side doesn't know how to sell, and they wonder why suddenly, the next year they're at half sales because they didn't know how to do it. So that causes problems. And then the customers are like, well, this isn't the company I was used to dealing with. Investors, a big deal. So you see that a lot of times in things like restaurants and alike, where people will have investors, they think it's a great concept, and then the concept doesn't take off. And so those investors will suddenly come in and say, we're only going to give you money if so-and-so goes out of the business. Or we're only going to say if so-and-so stays in the business. And then the same thing with your purchaser. So let's say you want to go and sell a business. A purchaser of the business isn't necessarily going to say, well, I'm going to cut you a check, because they need transition. So maybe they want to employ the very person who wants to leave. And so that's going to affect the ability to actually exit out. They say, well, we'll be happy to give you the money for this, but they have to stay for another 2 or 3 years. And let's say the person didn't have that kind of a plan, so that causes its own issues. Legal, I told you about licensing. That's a huge issue, as I commented on before. The court system, we're going to talk about kind of your court remedies in a little bit, but the courts will decide a lot of times about what you can and cannot do if you go to litigation. And then agencies the same way. So those are your state agencies. So Department of Labor is a big deal. When you go in and you violate wage laws and class actions get filed because someone didn't pay minimum wage and overtime and unemployment, all those types of things, they can come in and shut you down. right? You can get blacklisted. And so people forget about that sometimes the remedy is you're no longer in business, especially when you're talking about things like certified payroll. If you're in a trade and you're doing any kind of government work, if you get on that list, suddenly your business can't operate in the way it did. Or let's say that you have mostly government work and then you have this tiny bit that's private, you can't sustain yourself. So they'll decide that. And then at the bottom, which this is kind of the obvious, right? We have your spouses. They're going to determine that. Your older generation, so that's the sort of control issues that you might have. Medical issues, unexpected medical issues can affect the ability to continue with a business that we don't foresee. And then age retirement, right? No one wants to work till they're 80 years old, but many people have to work, beyond when they want to. And a lot of times you'll see people knee-jerk react and really what they think is retirement, they're thinking 65, 70. But if you've owned a business, your burnout rate doesn't happen at 65, 70, it happens in your 50s, right? And so now you're like, I want out, I've done so much all these years, and if you didn't have good planning, that may or may not work out. But then what you have is a tail off in the way the business is being run, and it causes its own issues. Okay, so those are kind of the influence side of things. So the founder dies, and I kind of have this kind of in a sort of a common to more uncommon. So we have the founder dies or becomes impaired. It's probably the number one issue where the person who's running the business suddenly can't do it for any number of reasons. And then right behind it is a family member with skills or the customer's wants out. That's the burnout rate that happens where someone just one day says, I just can't do this anymore. Or they have a bad experience with a customer that just kind of burns them out. The next would be the partner and the investor who wants out of the business. That's a very common situation. Investors actually drive it as much as partners. You suddenly thought you were going to get the money for this year's payroll and then suddenly you don't have it. And then that'll usually drive the partner who wants out of it. The technology or the service will become obsolete. That's the one that we were talking about where the product and service that you have suddenly is not something that anybody wants. The divorce situation. We have key people who leave the company. That's actually something that people do not expect. When you have a down economy, people panic, and you could have had 20 people working for you and half your group leaves. That could devastate a company. And so the more talented your people are, the more likelihood they're going to be pushed along. And if you haven't planned for that, then that's going to be an issue. Your creditors start collecting. So now we're talking about the financial issues where you're not paying bills. You're like, well, what are they going to do about it? Are they going to sue me? Yes, they're going to sue you. That's exactly. And when they have secured interest to your company, they have a lot of remedies they can come in. One of the worst experiences I ever had, and it was a bank situation where the banker who was involved in deciding whether how to handle a distressed company was really aggressive. And overnight, a company had all of their assets seized because they had a clause, and a lot of commercial contractors will have a clause that basically allows the bank to come in and act as you. They don't even have to give you notice. And it is legal because I defend it, and that's how I know it's enforceable. And they'll come and sweep it. And it's like, well, what bank would do that? Don't they know how great of a business I am? Yeah, except for when the bank doesn't have an appetite for it anymore. And what happens is they don't care because they want to get it off their books. So that's something that people do not expect. They're like, oh, well, it's always been this way. But always been this way doesn't, overnight can change. And you have the same issue with employment situations. Kind of a very common situation, this happens kind of in construction industry, where everything's been going a certain way. The labor unions, they don't do anything, they don't ever come down and breathe on our necks if we do this. Or our employees are good, they're never going to file a claim against us and all that. And all of a sudden you find out that what you expected to happen is changed overnight and you're not ready for that. And it will affect what happens with the business. Then you have the next two about vendors not extending credit and banks limiting your funding. That happens, right? Where all of a sudden your debt equity is out of whack and nothing's really changed in your world, but the bank's appetite is changed, and all of a sudden they will cut your credit. And you're like, well, they can't do that. Well, yes, they can. And it doesn't matter that affects your ability to pay tomorrow, and you have to be ready for that. And then finally is the government shutdown, and I bring that, obviously COVID being the one that we've all experienced. That would have been something that no one would have thought about. But there's other issues that have to do with, like I said, licensing issues and strikes, getting back to the labor issues, the things that you don't know. Right? Those are the kind of things that you can't control. Now, I have force majeure. Everybody's used to a force majeure now because when COVID happened, everybody said, how do I get out of this if I can't keep my business going? Most force majeure clauses, they're not unenforceable, but they're difficult to enforce, which is to say a lot of times the payment obligations continue under force majeure. And what's considered impossible to operate, it doesn't mean difficult to operate, it means impossible to operate. So if you remember, we had the essential versus the non-essential businesses. If you were an essential business, force majeure a lot of times didn't apply, even though you were at 50% capacity, because you could still go. It meant you literally could not open up your doors. And so I just warn people about that. Don't think that there's this like outbeat by virtue of the fact that you're going to be saved by something like that, because a lot of times you're not. So those are a lot of the common scenarios that we see. And like I said, if they kind of pique your interest, and if there's a question that you have specifically about those, by all means, let me know.
Thank you again for watching this informative session. If you have any questions about what you just heard, or want to contact us for legal or business consulting services, you can reach us at 630-230-8434 or email us at kmclaughlin@ma-lawpc.com. Have a wonderful day.